Because it causes you to miss visual cues.
Yeah, Joanne Muller, I have to leave it there. I apologize for interrupting you. The House is about to come into session. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Now, live coverage of the House.
I hereby appoint the Honorable Thomas Massie to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member, other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip, limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we proceed with the 15th week of the Republican policy of sequester, this House continues to avoid taking the steps it ought to be taking to replace the entire sequester with a balanced alternative. Instead, House Republicans have fully embraced the sequester's draconian cuts, which slash funding from our highest and lowest priorities equally, and put our economic recovery and national security at risk. Last week, they approved a rule deeming the Ryan budget's caps for next year, which locks in the sequester cuts. This is a blatant violation of the Budget Control Act agreement reached between the two parties in August of 2011. Now we're about to consider a defense authorization bill that shifts $54 billion in sequester cuts from the Pentagon onto domestic programs, which are already cut by sequesters like Head Start, Meals on Wheels, rental assistance for low-income families. How shameful. This follows the passage of 2 appropriation bills last week as part of a strategy from Republicans we've seen before. It came as no surprise that they chose to consider 2 of the most popular bills first, those that fund programs that protect our homeland security and provide care for our veterans. I'm glad there's bipartisan consensus that these bills represent important funding priorities. But let me quote from an Associated Press article from June 4th, which sheds some light on their strategy, and I quote, "The boost for veterans came even as Republicans controlling the chamber marched ahead with a plan that would require most other domestic programs to absorb even deeper cuts next year than those in place now after the imposition of across-the-board spending cuts." This refers, of course, to the sequester. The article continues, and I quote, "Republicans are coping with a shortfall by slashing across a broad swath of domestic programs, forcing cuts in the range of 20%, for instance, to a huge domestic spending bill that funds aid to local school districts, health research, and enforcement of labor laws." The article goes on to say, the GOP strategy is to, early on, advance popular bipartisan bills for which almost all of us voted, and then bring up bills making deep cuts later in the summer, if at all. In fact, I predict that they will not bring up most of the bills, notwithstanding their discussions about regular order. By insisting on budget numbers that not only include the sequester, but cut even further into domestic priorities, in clear violation of the Budget Control Act and the agreement that we reached between the two parties, Republicans are torpedoing any chances of reaching a big and balanced solution to deficits. The longer we wait, Mr. Speaker, to forge a compromise that can replace the entire sequester with a balanced alternative, the more pain will be felt across our economy and the greater the risk will be to our national security. Just ask the Joint Chiefs, not us. Let me review just some of the sequester's many effects. 70,000 kids kicked off Head Start, 10,000 teachers' jobs at risk from Title I cuts, furloughs to cause delays in processing retirement and disability claims, 4 million fewer meals for seniors, 125,000 less HUD rental assistance vouchers, emergency unemployment past 26 weeks cut 11% for 2 million Americans out of work, 2,100 fewer food safety inspections, longer waits to approve new drugs, furloughs equivalent to 1,000 fewer federal agents, FBI, border, etc., on the job. We talk about border security while at the same time slashing border guards. One-third of combat air units are grounded in America. It has now been over 70 days since the House passed its budget and since the Senate did the same. Regular order. Yet Speaker Boehner, who claims to wish regular order for this House, will not appoint conferees. Or shall I say he is unable to do so as a result of a severely divided caucus. The Washington Post reported on June 3rd that the House Republicans had, and I quote, disintegrated into squabbling factions, no longer able to agree on, much less execute, some of the most basic government functions. It seems what matters is only a commitment to deep austerity and a weakened government. This ideology has achieved a dangerous manifestation in the sequester, which has been the Republican policy all along, and which, as I have pointed out in the past, was included in their cut, cap, and balance bill passed in July of 2011 when 229 members of their caucus voted for sequester as an option. Now we have further evidence that sequester is their policy as Republicans double down on these irrational cuts and refuse to negotiate. There is, however, Mr. Speaker, an alternative. That is a balanced bill that will replace the sequester entirely. The ranking member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Van Hollen, has put forward a proposal that deserves a vote. The Speaker so often says, let the House work its will. In fact, he has asked for a vote on it 6 times, Van Hollen has, and will ask for a 7th time at the Rules Committee today. But Speaker Boehner and Republican leader Cantor have so far said no. The House cannot work its will. The House cannot consider this option. The American people deserve to see where their representatives stand on a balanced alternative to the sequester, and they deserve a Congress where real compromise proves stronger than partisan maneuvering. If the Van Hollen alternative were to come to the floor for a vote, I would hope that a majority of members would vote for it. A majority of Democrats certainly would, and I believe a substantial number of Republicans who are concerned about our fiscal future. Hal Rogers, in fact, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, has opined how much pain the sequester would be causing and how much dysfunction it would be causing. It's exactly the kind of compromise approach we need, the Van Hollen alternative. All we're asking to do in the immediate term is for Speaker Boehner to let the House work its will and have a vote on Mr. Van Hollen's alternative and to follow regular order and agree to go to conference. That's what they said they wanted to do. That's what they said they would do. But they're not doing it. It's time for Democrats and Republicans to work together in a bipartisan way to rise to our budget challenges and set our country back on a sound fiscal path. Let us have regular order. Let us have a vote. And let us restore sanity to this House and replace the sequester with a balanced solution. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the nation learned of the plight of Sarah Murnigan, the 10-year-old who will die within weeks unless she gets a desperately needed lung transplant. There are no pediatric lungs available, but there may be adult lungs, which her doctors say would be entirely satisfactory for her condition. But because she's nearly 11-year-old, but not 12, the bureaucratic regulations prohibited it. As Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius could have modified those regulations to conform to the judgment of the doctors, but she wouldn't. Her warm words of sympathy for Sarah and her family at a congressional hearing last week were horrific. Some live and some die. Fortunately, a federal judge intervened and concluded what Sebelius wouldn't, that the regulations are arbitrary and capricious, and thank God Sarah is now on the adult transplant list. But the incident provided all of us with a chilling look at what health care will be like when bureaucrats like Kathleen Sebelius are making more and more of our health care decisions. Sebelius constructed a straw man to argue with. She said that we shouldn't have public officials making these choices, and a lung provided to Sarah necessarily means a lung denied to someone else. That is utterly disingenuous. Sarah's family, joined by many members of the House, we're not calling for Sebelius to pick winners or losers, but rather we're calling for her to place the judgment of the doctors ahead of the rigid one-size-fits-all dictates of the federal bureaucracy in all such cases, not just this one. And the fact is, Ms. Sebelius is picking who lives and who dies. The difference is that she is doing so not by deferring to the judgment of doctors, but rather by conforming to the cold and rigid regulations that cannot discern between individual cases. This is the process to which we are about to consign every American as government dictates every detail of their health coverage. Sorry, you're a few months too young or too old. Tough luck, some live and some die. My chief of staff grew up in the Soviet Union, where the first question asked when an ambulance was called was, well, how old is the patient? That's what bureaucracies do. They choose who wins and who loses, who lives and who dies, and they do so in a blind, cold, unthinking, and unreasonable manner. The fact is, we don't want officials making these choices, which is exactly what Ms. Sebelius was doing. Those decisions should not involve the government, but rather should be determined by the individual judgment of the professional physicians directly involved. Until the court stepped in, that's what this administration was impeding. And that shouldn't surprise us. This is the same administration that has substituted the individual medical insurance choices once made by families with the one-size-fits-all mandates of the very same federal officials who dismissively tell dying 10-year-olds some live and some die. Mr. Speaker, this incident was a dire warning to us all of the danger that lies ahead for every American. Remember that the same IRS that abused its fearsome authority to harass and intimidate ordinary Americans for political reasons next year will have the power to enforce the regulations over our family's choice of health plans under Obamacare. Mr. Speaker, each of us as Americans may one day face the same peril as Sarah Murnaghan because of what we set in motion by empowering this government to take an ever-widening role in our health care decisions. We have taken a process that once was determined by individual choice and was once guided by the professional judgment of the physicians who actually gathered around the patient's bed and turned those decisions over to the likes of Kathleen Sebelius. And I'm afraid in coming years we will pay dearly for that duplicity as we move ever closer toward the brave new world of bureaucratically controlled health care that we can already see so clearly through a 10-year-old's life or death battle with the federal bureaucracy. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to announce my reintroduction of the state's Ethics Law Protection Act. At a time when indictments and allegations of ethics violations of our elected leaders have become all too common, now more than ever we must use every tool at our disposal to fight corruption. Unfortunately, the federal government is currently preventing numerous states from using one of the most important tools we have to fight cronyism, corruption, and waste. My home state of Illinois, which is no stranger to these issues, along with several other states around the country, has taken a stand against corruption by passing laws to eliminate shady pay-to-play contracting. Pay-to-play politics is the practice of trading campaign contributions for lucrative government contracts. Pay-to-play practices erode the integrity of our public works projects and allow individuals to profit at the expense of American taxpayers. It is the most common example of government corruption. Fortunately, it is also one of the easiest to solve. Anti-pay-to-play laws are designed to ensure that the competitive bidding process for government contracts is open and fair, not rigged or otherwise biased by lining the campaign pockets of those responsible for awarding the contracts. Amazingly, a loophole created in a previous administration and the Federal Highway Administration's contracting requirements is making it difficult, if not impossible, for states to implement these anti-corruption laws. The federal government has threatened to cut off highway funds to any state that passes an anti-pay-to-play law. The Highway Administration's competitive bidding requirements have been interpreted to mean that states can't weed out corrupt contractors. Clearly, this was not the intent of Congress when it passed these requirements. That is why I am reintroducing the States Ethics Law Protection Act. This important measure simply amends the Federal Highway Administration's contracting requirements to allow states to pass these important laws, and ensures states that do pass anti-corruption laws do not face financial penalties for doing so. It is time for us to make it clear that Congress supports the right of states to fight corruption as they see fit. States have the right to ensure their contracting conforms to the highest ethical standards and offers the best value to taxpayers. It is not the Federal Highway Administration's place to second-guess a state on how to best ethically award contracts. States like Connecticut, New Jersey, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky have all passed laws like Illinois to root out this kind of blatant corruption. These states should be applauded, not punished, for doing the right thing. By amending the Federal Highway Administration's contracting requirements, we can ensure that states have every tool at their disposal to encourage transparency and accountability. Our states have shown they are ready to reform. It is now our duty to ensure they have the ability to implement these reforms. I am often asked what the true cost of corruption is. I will tell you, in my view, coming from Illinois, it is the loss of the public's trust. We cannot lead without this trust. And at this critical juncture, we must do all we can to restore trust and inspire the confidence of people across this country. Thank you, and I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, for 5 minutes.
The Justice Department targets Associated Press, Fox News, and other journalists. For political reasons, the State Department and White House contrive a false story about Americans murdered in Benghazi. Cover-ups ensue. The President promotes rather than fires the principal deceiver. The President promises to punish the Benghazi murderers, yet the only person jailed is a scapegoated filmmaker the White House falsely blamed for inspiring the Benghazi attacks. Armed federal SWAT agents raid Gibson Guitar and threatened to put Gibson Guitar out of business. Why? Gibson Guitar imported the same guitar materials they have imported for years. Yet Martin & Company, a Gibson Guitar competitor, imports the same guitar materials with impunity. The difference? Gibson Guitar's CEO contributes to Republicans like Congressman Marsha Blackburn and Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, while Martin's CEO contributes $35,000 to Democrats. The IRS targets law-abiding citizens who use names like Tea Party and Patriots and dare exercise their freedom of association and speech rights. In one particularly outrageous example, Texan Catherine Engelbrecht is investigated and harassed by the IRS, the FBI, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Why? Engelbrecht founded the King Street Patriots, which hosts weekly discussions on economic freedom, and True the Vote, which trains volunteers to fight voter fraud. The White House manages the Fast and Furious gun-running scandal that left hundreds of Mexicans and an American Border Patrol agent dead. Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius unethically and perhaps unlawfully shakes down companies she regulates for donations to support Obamacare. President Obama thumbs his nose at America's immigration laws by not only giving millions of illegal aliens a free pass, Obama rewards illegal conduct by giving illegal aliens work permits in direct violation of American law, thereby undermining the ability of Americans to obtain good-paying jobs. America is in uncharted waters when our own federal government aggressively undermines our rights of freedom of speech and association, rights won with American blood on the battlefields of Lexington and Concord, Trenton and Princeton, Saratoga, Cowpens and Kings Mountain, and Yorktown. Mr. Speaker, America faces a policy debate between privacy and national security. 50 years ago, our foes were well-known nation-states like Communist China and the Soviet Union. Now, our enemies may be foreign neighbors, foreign tourists, or even foreign students. Foreign terrorists seek chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons of mass destruction that can destroy an American city or murder hundreds of thousands of Americans in a single attack. As America seeks the proper balance between our privacy rights and national security, one thing stands out. Americans must be able to trust our federal government to do the right thing with the privacy information Americans give up. If we cannot trust the federal government to use our privacy information solely for anti-terrorism purposes, then the balance shifts. We will not give up our privacy information, thereby increasing the risk of a successful weapon of mass destruction terrorist attack on American city. More and more, our own federal government disregards the rule of law that is essential to avoid the strife and bloodshed of anarchy. More and more, the federal government targets American citizens who differ politically with the White House. While the IRS, Gibson Qatar, Benghazi, Fast and Furious, and numerous other scandals are troublesome, the bigger picture is that this White House, this administration, has breached the public's trust. The bigger scandal is that this White House, this administration, by their breach of trust, has undermined America's national security and thereby risked American lives. Mr. Speaker, the White House can still do the right thing, but the right thing is not cover-ups. The right thing is not rewarding and promoting political cronies and lawbreakers. The right thing is, with full and open candor, telling the American people the truth about these scandals. The right thing is very publicly and aggressively firing offending federal employees. The right thing is very publicly prosecuting lawbreakers. Then and only then will the trust of the American people in the federal government be restored. Then and only then can America fight the war on terror with certainty that we will win. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to commend 2 young men from Richmond, California, who will begin classes this fall at Tallahassee Community College in Tallahassee, Florida. Sounds pretty straightforward, I know, but these are no ordinary students. What makes these young men from my congressional district stand out is their background. It's not just that most people thought they would never go to college. In fact, most people thought they would never make it out of the neighborhood. People thought they'd end up in jail or even worse. Devondre Woodward and Eric Welch, 2 senior fellows at the City of Richmond's Office of Neighborhood Safety Peacekeeper Fellowship, an office that does a remarkable job in changing violent lives. Devondre and Eric are shining examples of what remarkable transformation individuals are capable of when they desire to make a positive change in their lives and when they're supported in that effort. From a life dominated by gun violence in the streets of Richmond to noses buried in books at college, internships in Washington, D.C., and meetings on Capitol Hill, these young men have come a long way. I wish them the best. I hope their success will serve as an inspiration to many more to follow in their steps and leave the violent streets. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, last week, just after supper time in the neighborhood of McLean, Georgia, a 14-year-old girl, we'll call her Sarah, was jumping on a neighbor's backyard trampoline. Suddenly, Sarah heard a noise and looked up only to see a low-flying object hovering overhead. It was a small, controlled flying object. It was a drone. It had a blinking red light coming from it. The object hovered over her for about 10 minutes. She began to get real nervous and uneasy, so she jumped off the trampoline, ran home to tell her parents, but the flying object continued to follow her. She told her mother. So her mother walked outside into the street, observed the flying object, and suddenly the object moved away into another neighbor's backyard where 3 other teenage girls were sitting in the pool. The small drone hovered over them momentarily, then it moved away. The police were called. They arrived at the scene and told the citizens, "Sorry, there's nothing we can do." Mr. Speaker, this sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. Someone up to no good spying on teenage girls with a drone. Mr. Speaker, drones are easy to find and easy to obtain. A simple Google search, you will find out that one can buy a drone on eBay or go down the street and buy one at Radio Shack. According to the FAA, the group that monitors and issues permits for drones, by 2030, there will be 30,000 drones cruising American skies, looking, observing, filming, spying, hovering over America. We will not know who they are, or what they're up to, or what they're looking at, or what their purpose is, whether it's permitted or really not permitted, whether it's lawful or unlawful. And we won't know who's flying those drones. There are legitimate uses for government and private citizens for the use of drones, but a nosy neighbor or snooping government should not be able to spy on citizens without legal guidelines. As technology changes, Congress has the responsibility to be proactive and protect the Fourth Amendment right of all citizens, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Thus saith the Constitution. Nowadays, especially, Americans are concerned about their Fourth Amendment rights being taken away. Well, no kidding. The right of a reasonable expectation of privacy is a constitutional right. The general rule is snooping, spying, surveillance, or eavesdropping goes against the basic rights outlined in the Constitution. That is why I've introduced the Preserving America Privacy Act along with Representative Zoe Lofgren from California. Congress must be proactive in protecting the rights of civilians from private use and government use of drones. This legislation balances individual constitutional rights with legitimate government activity and the private use of drones. The bill sets forth clear guidelines, protects individual privacy, and informs peace officers so they will know what they can and cannot do under the law. There will be limits of government use of drones so that the surveillance of individuals or their property is only permitted or conducted when there is a warrant based on probable cause, as the Constitution requires. And of course there will be exceptions. They are called exigent circumstances, which is already in our law. And these will apply, as it does now, regarding search and seizure. Those exceptions include fire and rescue, monitoring droughts and floods, assist in other emergency cases, or to chase a fleeing criminal. The bill also allows for the use of drones for border security. The bill also sets forth guidelines for the private use of drones. Basically, private citizens cannot use drones to spy on others without consent of the landowner or that person. Congress has the obligation to set forth guidelines to secure the right of privacy and protect citizens from unlawful drone surveillance while maintaining lawful private and government use. Drone laws are needed because a peeping Tom should not be able to spy on young girls who are in the privacy of their backyards just because the peeping Tom has the ability to do so. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Sinema, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 5 minutes and provide for extra remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brandy Reiner, Jack Welty, Andy Albright, Diego Soto, Anthony Carley, Ellen Hamilton, Ariel Carlos, Joe Slavin, Brandy Pantaleone, Gary Brewer, Christopher Valles.
These are the students and college graduates from Arizona State University, my alma mater, who shared their stories with me. Some of these young adults are my students at Arizona State University, where I teach. Some are recent graduates. Some are thinking of starting a family, while others are working hard to care for the families they already have. What do these graduates want? They just want a fair shot. They want to know that their hard work in college mattered, that it led to the promise that their parents made to them when they were little, the promise we all believe in. If you work hard and play by the rules, you will succeed. Essentially, they want what each of us wanted for ourselves, what we want for our own kids, what we're working for in our districts. They want a shot at the American dream. Instead, as Brandy Reiner begins her life and career as a social worker, having just graduated from ASU last month, she will face the biggest financial hurdle of her life. She doesn't face massive medical bills or an expensive car loan. It's not rent or a mortgage payment. It's a bill for over $100,000 in student loans. 18 days. 18 days, that's all the time we have to stop student loan interest rates from doubling. 18 days makes a lot of difference to the young people who will have to pay thousands of additional dollars to the federal government at a time in their lives when those dollars matter the most. Christopher Valles has $20,000 in debt, and he's just a freshman. Gary Brewer, $57,000 in debt. Kent Fogg, $70,000. Sarah Curitan, $74,000. The Federal Reserve has noted that the U.S.'s $1 trillion in student debt is further constricting our economy. Young people are foregoing long-term job opportunities and home ownership in order to meet the urgent demands of their large student loan payments. And today, as they work hard to find jobs in this recession that they didn't cause, Congress debates whether to force students to pay more in order to pay down Congress's debt. Brandy, Christopher, Gary, Kent, Sarah, these graduates should not have to foot the bill for Congress's failure. In 18 days, I want to go back to Arizona and tell these students that I took their stories to Congress and that their stories mattered, that their experiences made a difference. When these young adults tell me that they just want a shot at the American dream, that they're working hard, playing by the rules, and doing everything they can to live that dream, then they've done their part. Now it's time for us to do ours. I challenge us, all of us, Republicans, Democrats, senators, representatives, I challenge us to stand together and do the right thing. Stop the finger pointing and the cynical posturing. Instead, we must act together to keep student loan interest rates affordable. The clock is ticking. There's no time to waste. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the past week, we have heard about a series of major violations of our civil liberties, including the fact that NSA is collecting the phone records of tens of millions of Americans. This wholesale snooping on innocent Americans is an unacceptable violation of one of our most basic freedoms, the right to privacy and to be free from government surveillance, and one of many unintended but predictable consequences of the USA Patriot Act. I proudly voted against reauthorization of the Patriot Act 3 times because of its potential for abuse, and more people are starting to see that abuse. Even former Vice President Al Gore, not somebody I usually or normally agree with, even he had the right response to the NSA report. He tweeted, "In a digital era, privacy must be a priority. Is it just me, or is secret blanket surveillance obscenely outrageous?" And I tweeted back, "Crazy, but I agree." Of course, what's happening with the NSA is just the latest example of the government abusing its power. We've all heard about the IRS scandals in which one of the most powerful agencies in the government deliberately targeted conservative organizations for audits and other forms of harassment. We've all heard about what happened with Fox News reporter James Rosen, whose phone was tapped by the Justice Department, even though Attorney General Eric Holder testified before the House Judiciary Committee that, quote, that potential prosecution of the press for the disclosure of material that is not something that I have ever been involved with, heard of, or would think would be wise policy, close quote. Needless to say, what Mr. Holder said under oath is sharply at odds with what happened to Mr. Rosen, and I've joined with my Judiciary Committee colleagues in sending a letter to Mr. Holder requesting that he appear before the committee again to explain these discrepancies. Then just last Friday, it was reported that the NSA and the FBI are tapping directly into the central servers of 9 leading U.S. Internet companies, including Google, Facebook, and YouTube. Who knows what we'll find out next? When thinking about all these scandals, I'm reminded of what James Madison wrote in Federalist 51 in the early days of our country. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself, close quote. In recent years, many members of both parties have forgotten Mr. Madison's lesson, a lesson that infuses our founding document, the U.S. Constitution, that government powers must be limited because governments, by their very nature, have a hard time controlling themselves. During the Bush years, many Republicans ignored that truth, and in the Obama era, many Democrats have ignored it too. What's happening with the NSA, the IRS, the DOJ, and other agencies should correct the misguided idea that it's okay to give the government more powers so long as the right party is in power. Because parties change, and to quote Madison again, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. For all of these reasons and more, I voted against the USA Patriot Act, which, despite its nice name, was written in such a sweeping way that it opened the door for the NSA to invade the privacy of millions of Americans. That is because the USA Patriot Act, Section 215, allows the FBI to seek the production of tangible things to obtain foreign intelligence and to protect against clandestine intelligence activities. But since it does not require that either the caller or the recipient of the call be a foreign agent or located abroad, you can see how the FBI could be tempted to collect broad swaths of data concerning Americans' phone calls to detect patterns of activity, as many analysts suggest may have happened in this case. That is why last Thursday, I joined several of my House colleagues in sending a letter to FBI Director Mueller and NSA Director Alexander requesting more information concerning their data collection activities. Given public outrage about the NSA's abuse of power, it is time for Congress to re-examine all sections of the USA Patriot Act, and I am hopeful my colleagues will join me in starting that re-examination. Now is the time to work together to reduce the scope of government power before it becomes so large and so impenetrable that regaining our freedoms becomes almost impossible. Now is our moment, and we must seize it. I yield back my time.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Roybal Allard, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, today is International Day Against Child Labor, which gives us the opportunity to reflect on the plight of hundreds of millions of children throughout the world who perform work that endangers their health, deprives them of an adequate education, and denies them basic freedoms and protections. Unfortunately, the United States is not immune to the scourge of child labor. Long hours and dangerous working conditions are sadly a reality for hundreds of thousands of children working in our country's fields and farms. Throughout our nation, there are children like Zulema, who at age 12 works in the fields picking fruits and vegetables, while her classmates spend afternoons doing homework and playing with friends. Despite her young age, Zulema, frequently with bare hands, wields adult-size harvesting shears. When crop dusters fly overhead, she is often covered in pesticides meant to kill insects in the field. In spite of Zulema's exposure to these serious and dangerous conditions, she takes home to her struggling family a mere $64 a week. Our farming industry is alarmingly plagued by preventable tragedies like the one in Mount Carroll, Illinois, where a 14-year-old boy cleaning a grain bin suffocated to death when he was sucked into a sinkhole of flowing corn. Tragic accidents like this underscore the fact that agriculture is one of our nation's most dangerous industries. Yet, it is the only industry where our children are not protected equally by our child labor laws. While reserved for adults in every other occupation, in agriculture, children as young as 16 are allowed to perform hazardous work like driving tractors and operating chainsaws. It is also the only industry in which children as young as 12 are allowed to labor in the fields with virtually no restrictions on the number of hours they work outside of the school day. To address this shameful reality in our country, I am reintroducing the Children's Act for Responsible Employment, better known as the CARE Act. While retaining current exemptions that protect family farms and agricultural education programs like 4-H and Future Farmers of America, the CARE Act raises labor standards and protections for farm worker children to the same level set for children in all other occupations. Specifically, the CARE Act ends our country's double standard that allows children employed in agriculture to work at younger ages and for longer hours than those working in all other industries. The bill raises the minimum age for agriculture work to 14 and restricts children under 16 from work that interferes with their education or endangers their health and well-being. The CARE Act also prohibits children under the age of 18 from working in agricultural jobs which the Department of Labor has declared particularly hazardous. This is consistent with current law governing every industry outside of agriculture. Mr. Speaker, no child should be discriminated against based on the work they do. All of America's children deserve to be protected equally under our laws. It is our moral obligation to do all in our power to protect the rights, safety, and educational future of our most precious resource, America's children. The time has come for the United States of America to bring our child labor laws in line with our American values and give all of our children the fundamental protections they rightfully deserve. I urge my colleagues to support and to help pass the CARE Act. I yield back the balance of my time.
Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
The House returns at noon Eastern for legislative work. On their agenda today, a number of bills that would alter provisions of the 2010 Dodd-Frank Financial Regulations Law. Later this afternoon, lawmakers will begin consideration of the 2014 Defense Authorization Act. The bill sets $552 billion in spending for national defense and an additional $86 billion for the war in Afghanistan and other overseas contingency operations. Votes are scheduled throughout the afternoon. We'll have live coverage when the House returns here on C-SPAN. C-SPAN 3, meanwhile, has live coverage now of several hearings today. Going on right now, Secretary Chuck Hagel